Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. A word about CESPA. It's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. It tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. And this program is part of that effort. Now, for this episode, I will eschew the usual practice of an opening to position the discussion. Instead, I'm going to go straight to my guest today, Dr. Andrew Bacevich. Dr. Bacevich, a former U.S. Army colonel, is Professor Emeritus of History and International Relations at Boston University and Chairman of the Board of Directors of Quincy Institute, which he co-founded in 2019. So what I plan to do is to read a few excerpts from Professor Bacevich's 2016 book, America's War for the Greater Middle East, and link it up with his latest book, which came out in 2021 and is called After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed. Now, this book came out just before the Taliban rolled into Kabul, and of course, at least 8 or 9 months before Russia attacked Ukraine. So I propose to then position current events in Europe and Gaza and discuss them with Professor Bacevich through the framework he has used in the two books that I've cited. And incidentally, these are not the only two books that he has written. He is the author of many more books also. But let me begin with a couple of points. As I said, I'm going to read out some excerpts from America's War for the Greater Middle East. So Professor Bacevich says that among the factors that contribute to the lack of any serious challenge to the war's perpetuation. He is obviously talking about America's long, almost never-ending war in the Greater Middle East. He says 4 stand out. One is the absence of an anti-war or anti-interventionist political party worthy of the name. Obviously, a political party is talking about a political party in the US. A second reason, directly related to the first, is that politicians aspiring to high office, especially those contemplating a bid for the presidency, find it more expedient to support the troops, quote unquote, support the troops, and therefore the war, than to question the war's efficacy or to propose alternative approaches to satisfying US objectives in the Islamic world. A third reason, of course, is that some individuals and institutions actually benefit from an armed conflict that drags on. And here, Professor Bacevich is talking about, different forms of profits, jobs, and campaign contributions, and also the military-industrial complex and its beneficiaries, which he says, for which perpetual war is not necessarily bad news. And then finally, which is the fourth factor, and perhaps most importantly, there is this. Thus far, at least, Americans themselves appear oblivious to what is occurring. Policymakers have successfully insulated the public from the war's negative effects. And there is another point here which deals with what the Americans care for. And one of the things that Professor Bacevich mentions is guaranteeing the safety and well-being of Israel. So we're going to get to that also. But as he says, finally, this is like the ultimate paragraph of the book. Perpetuating the war for the Greater Middle East is not enhancing American freedom, abundance, and security. If anything, it is having the opposite effect. One day, the American people may awaken to this reality. Then and only then will the war end. When this awakening will occur is impossible to say. For now, sadly, Americans remain deep in slumber. So this is as far as America's war for the Greater Middle East is concerned. Now, let me just say that in his 2021 work, which, as I said, which is titled After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed, he wants to refocus national security. In other words, pivoting to the actual threats, what he thinks are actual threats America has ignored, and which he has argued in the book, which are revealed during the apocalyptic wake-up call of 2020, under investment in pandemic-containing health measures, systemic racism, climate change, etc. Now, to this end, he proposed that the US should withdraw from NATO within a decade, pull the military out of the Middle East, recast terrorism as a criminal matter for law enforcement and courts rather than US soldiers, and cut military aid to Israel. Now, I've just given you a very sort of, a bird's eye view, not even a bird's eye view, but just a, bare bones kind of pointers to what he's been arguing. And he has argued these points in various other works also, Limits to Power and so on and so forth. So, Professor Bacevich, thank you so much for being on the program. I'm really grateful.
Thank you.
Let's begin kind of in reverse, starting with what is happening right now. So, two places which are witnessing hot wars, Ukraine, and now, of course, since 7th October, Hamas's attack on Israel and Israel's response. Now, you wanted the US to get out of NATO, and you also proposed that the US should stop aid to Israel. Because of the Russo-Ukraine war, far from the US withdrawing from NATO, NATO is further expanding. Now have, Sweden and Finland, two states that through the Cold War never were part of NATO. And we have, the US arms supplies going to Israel, and the Biden administration is talking about $100 billion this support injection, if you will, into to sustain Israel's military as well as Israel's economy. So how far do you think have we come, or the world has come, from what you had been proposing either in 2016 or later in 2021?
Oh, I've had zero influence. I mean, I appreciate the fact that some people have read my books, have read my commentaries, but I'm very much a minority voice, and I think that the assumptions that have informed our war for the greater Middle East, and the assumptions informing U.S. policy with regard to Israel and the Middle East are still intact. And if anything, and your question implies this, if anything, the war with Russia and the war in Gaza have simply reinforced the pre-existing tendencies in U.S. policy, and have, for all practical purposes, eliminated even the possibility of serious debate about U.S. policy. So, if anything, I think that we are incrementally returning to the Cold War as a basis of U.S. policy. The notion that the United States is caught up in an existential competition with identifiable rivals, and that nothing should interfere with arming ourselves and engaging in that competition. Now, the principal adversary is China, of course, not Russia, certainly not Hamas. But in some senses, I think that the two ongoing wars have served to reinforce this tendency to return to the Cold War. Okay.
Now, I was talking to Professor Mearsheimer 2 years ago. And it was on Sino-US. We were still away from the Russo-Ukraine war.
Right.
And the Middle East was kind of looking peaceful in the sense with Israel sort of reaching out to Arab states and trying to make Palestinians irrelevant and the rest of it. But so he was insisting, as he just did. In fact, just 2 days ago, I watched his talk at one of the think tanks in Brisbane, where he's talking about, and it's something that he's been saying for a very long time, that the United States is making a huge blunder by not pivoting to East Asia,
right,
and by getting itself bogged down in Europe, and now also in the Middle East. Now, he and Professor Walt also, as you know, wrote a book back in 2006, which became very controversial. And it was with reference to the Israel lobby.
Right.
And their main argument essentially was that what the US is doing in relation to Israel is actually decreasing US security rather than enhancing it.
Mm-hmm.
So, given this, and I'm assuming that you also sort of lean towards the same kind, if not entirely, but at least partially, to the kind of analyses that Professors Mearsheimer and Walt have been presenting over the years. Now, if the predisposition or whatever the structural bind is, which actually got the US into where it finds itself, and given these conflicts, which are going to only strengthen these predispositions, what exactly is the prognosis? I mean, is it going to enhance the US security and the security of the US allies, or do you think it's going to reduce that?
Well, you reduce the question to its essence. And I think that the simple answer to a complex question is that our current, the track that we are currently on is going to undermine U.S. security, and quite frankly, is going to undermine U.S. democracy. I don't agree with everything Mearsheimer says. He's a political scientist, and his view of the world, I think, is one of sort of tectonic plates interacting according to identifiable rules. He does not allow a lot of room for history or for the human factor, but he's not entirely wrong in his analysis, which foresees this coming conflict between the U.S. and China. I think that the book that you referred to by Mearsheimer and Walt, The Israel Lobby, was an imperfect book, but a tremendously important book because it allowed Americans for the first time to openly acknowledge that there is an Israel lobby, and it's quite influential. Might not be as influential as Mearsheimer and Walt insisted, but it's an important part in our politics. Now, I think where I come from at the present moment is this, that the greatest challenges facing the United States are actually domestic. I'm not sure the extent to which, from a Pakistani vantage point, you would agree with this. But American democracy is very weak and very vulnerable at the present moment. The rise of Trumpism, of this right-wing populism, is emblematic of that weakness. The fact that Mr. Trump was elected president, nearly reelected, the reality of the January 6th insurrection, and an effort to prevent Biden from becoming president, all these are dangerous indications of our internal weakness. That's where I come from. And therefore, my sort of point of departure in looking at America's role in the world is that the most important thing we need to do is to get our own house in order. We need to protect and preserve and strengthen American democracy. And that is actually of more immediate importance than strutting around the world and declaring that we are the indispensable nation and insisting that nobody can solve the world's problems apart from the United States. And sadly, that sort of rhetoric, that extreme rhetoric, is still current in things that Biden and his people say. So we need to become more modest in our expectations. We need to tend to our own knitting, or I think we will find that the United States is in deeper trouble than it already is. So when we talk about Europe, I've lost this argument. There's no question about it. But my argument, and that of others, I think of Walt and Mearsheimer, has been that decades after the Cold War, it's time for Europe to take responsibility for its own security. Now, when NATO was founded in 1949, and we were then in the early stages of the Cold War, a divided global order, at that point, Europe was weak. Britain was weak. Germany was divided. France was basically barely recovered from World War II, and so on. So there was an urgent need at that time for the United States to involve itself in European security, and therefore NATO made a lot of sense. Well, guess what? 2023 is not 1949. And Europe has recovered. Europe is prosperous. Europe is democratic. It's not perfect, but Europe is largely stable. The refusal of Europeans to take responsibility for their own affairs, the willingness of the United States to let the Europeans get away with this, is one of the factors that contributed to the Ukraine war. I'm not an apologist for Russia. I'm not trying to say that the Ukraine war is our fault. I would say that the Ukraine war was an avoidable war, and it was brought on in considerable part by the refusal of the United States to acknowledge that Russia does have its own set of vital interests that should be respected. We refuse to do so. And the war, in part, is a result of that. That does not, for a second, let Putin off the hook. It's a war of aggression that he initiated. Nonetheless, it's a war that didn't have to happen. And wiser American statecraft, I think, could have avoided it. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to come to the Russo-Ukraine war, but allow me to say this, and this might be a little provocative considering what you said about Trump and Trumpism, that for the liberal institutionalists, they would say, well, Professor Bacevich is partly going the same route of American isolationism that Trump was talking about, that the Europeans should spend more on their defense. It's America first. We need to sort of return back into sort of, our own homeland and focus on that. Of course, his agenda of focusing is a completely different one from yours. But are you suggesting that the United States should not play the role of a sheriff, even if a reluctant sheriff, just to invoke the title of long forgotten book by Richard Haas?
I am, but let's back up a second.
Okay.
Let's back up to the framing of U.S. policy.
Okay.
This term isolationism is an absolute fiction.
Okay.
The United States has never practiced isolationism. I mean, just think for a second. In 1776, the Republic is founded, 13 small, weak states huddled together along the eastern seaboard of North America. Fast forward to 1945, and the United States is the richest and the most powerful country on the planet. How did that happen? It did not happen as a result of American isolationism. The pattern of American behavior from the earliest days of the Republic, well into the 20th century, has been one of opportunistic expansionism. As the United States became bigger, more powerful, and richer. How did it do that? Well, through a number of ways. We bought Alaska from Russia. We took California in a war of aggression from Mexico. We seized an empire from Spain in 1898. We developed a pattern of imperialism in much of the Western Hemisphere in order to secure U.S. interests, all under the guise of spreading democracy. I'm not I'm neither criticizing nor endorsing this pattern of behavior. I am saying that's the reality of how the United States rose to primacy. And therefore, the argument that many people make that, oh, Bacevich, you are proposing a return to isolationism, the response is there never has been any such thing. I'm proposing a narrower and more realistic definition of American security interests appropriate to the actual condition of American democracy, which again, I would say is very weak and very vulnerable.
Right. Now, in the book about America's war for the Greater Middle East, your starting point sort of is the Carter Doctrine.
Right.
And you talk about Carter Doctrine, which said that any attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America.
Right.
And such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force.
Right.
Now, two things here. One is, I was kind of chuckling reading a review of your book by the late Peter Gowan, who was a left-leaning British professor and scholar, and he actually reviewed it for the New Left Review, and he said, and I quote, he talked about your very crisp, vivid, pungent prose with a dry sense of humor and sharp sense of hypocrisies. He also said that, and I quote from what he wrote, Bacevich is a conservative who explains that he believed in the justice of America's war against communism and continues to do so, but once it was over, came to the conclusion that US expansionism both preceded and exceeded the logic of the Cold War and needed to be understood in a longer, more continuous historical durée. Now, this, if we are talking about a longer trajectory, then as the radicals, and it's in the literature by most scholars, including Muslim scholars, and I use the term Muslim just simply to not in a religious sense, but in the sense of people from the Islamic countries. Going back, for instance, as far as the Middle East is concerned, going back to the Balfour Declaration, the letter to Lord Rothschild, and then of course the Sykes-Picot Pact. Why do you start with the Carter Doctrine? I mean, considering that history goes back, and it's for the Palestinians, it was the 1948 Nakba. Then the 67 dislocation. Now they're talking about a second Nakba as the Israeli offensive goes into Gaza. Mm-hmm. Why the Carter Doctrine?
The subtitle of the book is A Military History.
Correct. That's right.
And that's what I set out to write.
Yeah. Starting with Operation Eagle Claw.
Right. I was not implying and would not imply that prior to the Carter Doctrine, the U.S. had no interests or no policy in the Middle East. But I would insist that prior to the Carter Doctrine, the U.S. presence, the military presence, and military interests in the Middle East were minimal. The focus militarily, the focus was on Europe, the focus was on East Asia, and the Middle East was an afterthought. 1979, with the promulgation of the Carter Doctrine, interest within the Pentagon in that region of the world suddenly explodes. And in the years to follow, we've got bases, we've got overflight arrangements, we've got contingency planning. Now, initially, the contingency that drove the Pentagon was the likelihood, the presumed likelihood, of the Soviets using Soviet-occupied Afghanistan as a springboard to attack all the way to the Persian Gulf. this was always nonsense. It was never going to happen. But the contingency provided a basis for thinking about an expanded U.S. military role in the region. When the Cold War ends in 1989, the possibility of the U.S. fighting in Afghanistan seems to go away. It doesn't go away. And lo and behold, a new regional adversary emerges in the form of Saddam Hussein. So the contingency planning that had gone on for a decade, thinking about the Soviets as the enemy, now simply shifts over and sees Saddam as the enemy. And this project of expanding U.S. military presence in the region simply continues. And of course, becomes activated, as it were, in 1990 when Saddam invades Kuwait and the U.S. organizes the response that becomes the Gulf War of 1991. And from there on, the pattern of intervention becomes essentially endless.
Correct. So this is very interesting, and you obviously give great detail in your book with reference to this. But my question is that following Second World War, a recasting, for instance, in the Pacific, as far as Japan is concerned, recasting in toto, Germany, then West Germany, bases in Europe, bases in the Pacific. Now, if we present hindsight from this, one can argue that the United States thought, well, this is just another of those, regions, which is very important with reference to oil, with reference to sea lanes of communication, world trade. We've got bases everywhere. We've got the reach there, naval reach and air and land reach through the bases. So let's have bases here. And the countries are quite willing to allow us to station forces here. Was there any, I'm really interested in finding was there any assessment at that time within the Pentagon or the State Department or within the U.S. policymaking circles or in the think tanks of the Beltway where voices said, well, hold on, folks, let's rethink this? Or was it just, a gung-ho thing about, we've got to be there and so we're going to go in there?
There may have been contrary voices, but they were on the margins. And I think that after the fall of the Shah, a consensus formed quite quickly that insisted that the Persian Gulf, broadly defined, needed to be added to the list of regions of the world that were now qualified as of vital interest, a U.S. vital interest. We need to remind ourselves also that that process coincided with the fading of British imperial power. Yeah. In the post-World War II era, I think that it was accepted within Washington that Great Britain would, quote unquote, handle the Middle East. It had been part of the British sphere for decades, at least since World War I. And for a time, this turned out to be an illusion, but for a time, I think it was assumed in Washington that post-World War II, Great Britain would continue to be a near equal partner in policing the world. That turned out to be a false expectation, and I think that already revealed, really, I think, in 1956 with the Suez Crisis. But it took a decade more for the United States to own up to the fact that either it was going to become the principal power in the region or no one would be. And that prospect was unacceptable. Hence, we have the Carter Doctrine and all of the sequential actions.
Correct. So now, looking at where the situation is, for instance, in Europe, I was talking to some European scholars quite recently, and I said, we constantly talk about EU as if it's a single entity, but it is not. Within the EU, there are countries like Bulgaria, you've got, Slovakia, for instance, and Hungary, for that matter, who are already quite queasy about, throwing their lot completely in with the sanctions against Russia. And and Serbia is, of course, already fomenting trouble in Kosovo and elsewhere. And we know that it leans towards the Kremlin. So Europe is not really a house united that way. Germany, for all its financial heft, is not really in a position, per German scholars themselves, to shoulder this burden. France, which has always sort of tried to be the political leader of the European Union, is certainly not in a position. The UK is already out of the European Union and is, facing its own economic troubles. So this is a situation where the Europeans cannot really tackle this issue now that a hot war is going on. I mean, the biggest sponsor of military and other funds to Ukraine is the United States. So once again, the idea that the US should sort of back off and let the Europeans, pick up the baton is unlikely to happen.
Correct.
So what's the prognosis there? I mean, the US will continue. And frankly, by the looks of it, the Russians, after their initial, incompetence, especially not so much in terms of, their firepower and everything, but more in terms of the logistical blunders and their incapacity to sustain the main offensive at that time, which ironically became they had to withdraw from there. They've learned, and they have finally gone back to what they have classically done, which is to use artillery and dig in. So they're gonna, depending on how one looks at and how one defines victory, they're not gonna lose. I mean, they've already got 4 oblasts. They'll probably go for another 2 in areas which are Russian speaking and which are not ethnic Ukrainians. And they will keep Ukraine on the boil, or at least simmering, just like they did from 2014 until February 24, 2022. So how is it going to play out for the US and its allies?
Well, I think you're correct that the one of the important geopolitical effects of the Ukraine war has been to impart to NATO a new life. Yeah. And the argument made by people like me that Europe is wealthy enough to manage its own security has been pretty much demolished as a result of this war. Now, I mean, I would argue that, and I don't disagree with your sort of thumbnail description of how the war has gone. I think I would take a slightly different view and would say that, hey, wait a second. What does the course of the war thus far tell us about the likelihood of Russia marching on Berlin anytime soon? And the answer to that is it's not in the cards. Yeah. That Russia poses a very, apart from nuclear weapons, and we should never forget their existence here and their role, but apart from nuclear weapons, Russia poses a very limited threat to European security. Now, to the extent that Ukraine, which Russia sees as a vital security interest, to the extent that Ukraine becomes part of NATO, then all we're doing is setting the stage for a protracted confrontation. Maybe a hot war, maybe a cold war, but a crisis that is likely to go on for a long time. My argument, it didn't have to happen. And sadly, it has. And from my point of view, sadly, that means that the United States will continue to be responsible for European security from now until the end of time. And that'll make the Germans very happy, but it won't necessarily serve the interests of my country.
Correct. But here's the thing: if we accept, and when I say we, I'm talking about those who observe geopolitics, including the American scholars and policymakers, that there is a peer competition now between the United States and China. If we look at the world and say, okay, the unipolar moment is gone, and we now have a multipolar world with three powers, the US still sitting atop the pyramid, but China is very close, and Russia, a distant one, but still a great power. One would assume, rationally speaking, for the United States to have tried to pull Russia into some kind of collective security, European collective security arrangement, rather than pushing NATO down the Russian throat. And it's important that if we go back to the 2008 statement by George Bush, which he made in Kyiv, about the possibility and, as a matter of fact, a necessity of bringing Georgia and Ukraine into the NATO ambit. And this was, I think, if I remember correctly, April or May. And in August 2008, the Russians started operating against Georgia, and we know what happened, North Ossetia and, Abkhazia and the rest. So my point is that while, yes, Putin is responsible for this aggression, speaking purely from the point of view of realpolitik or Machtpolitik, if you will, and the whole concept of influencing the near abroad, which the United States does in the Western Hemisphere, I think Putin is playing by the same book.
Oh, yeah. That's exactly right. The only part of your analysis that I would disagree with respectfully is that I don't think that the emerging multipolar order is really limited to three key actors. Certainly the US, China, and Russia are key actors. But I think there are others. The so-called global South is clearly emerging as a more important player. That includes countries like India and Pakistan. It includes countries like Brazil that are, at least from an economic point of view, are going to be more important players. So to me, the entire global picture becomes more complex. And we need to acknowledge the complexity so that we don't fall for sort of simplistic solutions that might be dictated by political scientists, who want to, divide the planet up into neat little blocks.
No, human affairs can never be neat. Which is one reason I've always been kind of wary of mathematical models,
right?
Whether they are in economics or right. Sociology or political science. Mm-hmm. But and you're right. I mean, it's getting messier, unfortunately. Let's pivot back to the Middle East. With this war going on now, the United States has very clearly, very unequivocally, and very categorically, if you will, said that it stands behind Israel. And the entire project of normalization with the Arab states now lies in ruins. Frankly, Israel, even where it has its embassies in the MENA region, has had to pull out the staff from there because those states have said that, we cannot guarantee the safety and security of your staff.
Right.
And given what's happening across the world, not just in the Muslim world, but elsewhere in Europe and even in the US, which includes, incidentally, very discerning and empathetic Jewish voices.
Right.
I just had a couple of weeks ago, I had Daniel Levy on my program, and I the way he presented the Palestinian case, I think, was just fantastic. But the point is that this is also going to massively redound to the disadvantage of the United States, and it seems to point to a phase where finally everyone in the Middle East or the greater Middle East is going to say the United States is not an honest broker. And therefore, the US, not only will that reduce the US role, but it will also, reduce US security itself.
I mean, I would say that the United States has not been an honest broker in the region for decades.
Correct. But I was just saying that, relatively speaking, I mean, the whole point about the two-state solution and the rest of it. Right. And we know, I mean, if we go into the history, and you know this better than me, I mean, this book is, and many other books are testimony to that. But at least some kind of perception. Like, right. The reason I'm saying this is that just before this happened, the Biden administration was, feverishly working back channels to bring the Saudi-Israeli normalization, somehow get it to that, and to somehow, make the Palestinians irrelevant. And just one event, and it has just completely upended the entire paradigm.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the fiction has now become exposed.
Okay.
The fiction of the U.S. as honest broker, the fiction of a peace process, the fiction of a two-state solution that resulted in all kinds of cliches that politicians would recite on the Sunday news shows. All of that, I think, has been demolished. What will replace that? I don't know. I wouldn't even guess. But it doesn't seem to me that. And I'm not an Israeli, so I don't understand, the Israeli perspective. But it doesn't seem to me that after the horrors of October 7th and the subsequent war, that there is going to be any substantial political support within Israel for returning to a two-state solution. Whatever trust there existed between Israel and those who speak for the Palestinians, that trust has been pretty well demolished. So where we go from here, I think, is a mystery. The security instincts of the Israeli, the security tradition in Israel, I think, is based on the conviction that ultimately only Israeli military superiority can guarantee the well-being of the Jewish state, and this experience affirmed that point of view. Is going to affirm the view that Israel has to keep its boot on the neck of its immediate neighbors if the Israeli people are going to be safe. That may be a recipe for near-term Israeli security. It certainly will not be a recipe for peace in the region.
But Professor Bacevich, the problem is that there was another fiction. You talked about the fiction, or the fictive perception that the U.S. has ever been an honest broker, but there's also been another fiction. And that fiction was that Israel at any point, even after the Oslo agreement, was prepared to cede territory or allow some kind of sovereignty to the Palestinians. And this is something which I'm not saying. I mean, a number of Israeli commentators have said this and continue to say this.
You are absolutely correct. I mean, after Oslo, the process of establishing Israeli settlements in the West Bank, I don't think it simply continued, it accelerated. So we now have, I think the number is either 500,000 or 600,000 Jewish Israelis living in territory that ostensibly was going to be part of a sovereign Palestine. And that
too, the Palestinians, in terms of the Palestinian Authority, they agreed to just 22% of the 1967 territory. I mean, it was already a truncated piece of land.
Yes.
But the point that I was trying to make is that there has been a massive shift within the Israeli socio-political spectrum, where in the current government in Israel, which is being identified by everyone as the most right-wing government in the history of Israel, there are two ministers with important portfolios like national security and finance, both of whom are illegal settlers.
Right.
And
you can't make it up.
Yeah. I mean, so Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, both are illegal settlers, have been constantly talking about expanding these illegal settlements. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went to the United Nations last September, and he took a map of Israel, which showed the entire West Bank, the Golan Heights, and Gaza as part of Israel. So the point really is that, when you push a people to the wall where, they know that they're going to die anyway, they're going to take a lunge, and try to inflict whatever damage they can on the potential aggressor. So I think that is something that needs to be, but the point that I want to make is, as we're moving towards the closing of this program also, that a lot has changed since even your 2021 book, and a lot has changed since your 2016 book, that, the two books that I've been indexing here. Going forward, what is the prognosis? I mean, you talked about climate change. It's as someone referred to it, it's a gray rhino. You can see it coming, but somehow you are incapable of doing this. Anything. President Biden has allowed more oil drilling during his tenure than in the previous tenure. So where does and this is something which not even the most powerful state in the world can singly handle. It has to be a global effort.
Yes.
And then racism in the United States that you mentioned in your book. And then, of course, you've constantly been talking about the increasing weakness of the US democracy. Now, juxtapose all this with the geopolitical trends that are quite obvious now in the world. The prognosis, based on your work, frankly, seems to be extremely bleak.
That's my view. I mean, I get up in the morning and read the newspapers and feel even worse than I did the previous night when I went to bed. If I could offer a 3-point plan to fix this, I would be famous. I have no 3-point plan. I do insist, however, that when President Biden gave his speech to the nation from the Oval Office, I guess it's 2 weeks ago now, he repeated the famous line from Madeleine Albright, in which he insisted that the United States is, this is the quote, the indispensable nation, that the world depends upon American leadership. That's a delusion. I don't think it's ever been true. It's certainly not true today. And therefore, even though I can't tell you what's the avenue out of this predicament that we're in, I would insist that avenue does not begin with the notion that the United States can solve the world's problems. There's going to have to be appropriate for a multipolar order. There's going to have to be a multipolar solution. You made the point earlier that climate change, what did you call it? The gray rhinoceros?
Yes.
I mean, that is the gray rhinoceros. And if we continue to ignore the fact that it's charging down on us, then we're all going to be doomed. And I think hammering away at that point, an existential threat that requires a collective response may be the only way to get out of the predicament that we're in right now.
You mentioned President Biden's speech and his reference to Madeleine Albright. It's kind of really scary, because you might recall a 96 infamous interview by the late Madame Albright, where she was asked about 500,000 Iraqi children having died because of the sanctions, and the interviewer asked her, is that price worth paying? And if I remember her words correctly, words to that effect, she said that, it's a hard choice, but if you ask me, I think the price is worth it.
Right.
I don't think, lots of people never allowed her to live down that particular line. But since you mentioned President Biden quoting Madeleine Albright, given what's happening in Gaza, I just hope that he doesn't resort to quoting her in terms of millions being killed by the Israelis. But thank you so much, Professor Bacevich. I'm really grateful for your insights.
I enjoyed this very much, and I thank you for having me on.
This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussion. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.